Part 4. OOOHH. The mighty roar shattered the air. It was the signal for a slaughter to become a massacre of a different sort. In the blink of an eye, the hunters had become the hunted. Londas de Gelenpo had probably cursed his gods more times in the past 10 seconds than he had in the rest of his life. If the gods really did exist, then they should defeat that evil being right now. Londas was a faithful man. Why had the gods abandoned him? The gods did not exist. In the past, he had looked down on those people who did not believe in the gods as fools. After all, if the gods did not exist, how could the priests work their magic? And now, he realized that he was the foolish one. The monster before him, a death knight, for want of a better word, drew closer. He took 2 steps back in response, trying to get away from it. A shrill creaking noise came from his armor, and the sword he clutched in both hands was trembling uncontrollably. He was not the only one. The other 18 knights surrounding the Death Knight were all acting the same way. Although they were filled with fear, none of them ran. This was not courage. The grinding of their teeth could attest to that. If they could, they would run as fast and as far as they could. It was because they knew there was no escape. Londas's eyes shifted, pleading for help. This square was at the center of the village, where Londas and his men had gathered 60 or so villagers. They looked fearfully at Londas and his men, while a group of children were hiding behind a wooden watchtower. Some of the children held sticks, but none of them was in a fighting stance. It was all they could do not to drop their sticks. During Londas's attack on the village, they had chased the villagers to the central square. They searched the houses, and then, in order to root out anyone who was hiding in the cellars, they poured in alchemical oils and set them on fire. There were 4 knights standing guard around the village with bows, and their job was to shoot down anyone who tried to escape the village. They had done this several times now, and it could be said that they were old hands at this sort of thing. The massacre had taken a fair bit of time, but it had been successful, and they had gathered the serving villagers into one place. After that, they would release some of the prisoners as bait. It should have been like that, but Londas still remembered that moment. The sight of Arion flying through the air, after the last few villagers fled into the square. It should have been impossible. Nobody knew what was going on. How could they understand the reason why a trained, grown man in full plate armor, which still had some weight even if it was lightened by magic, could fly through the air like a ball? After soaring about 7 meters through the air, he fell to the earth with a thunderous crash and lay still. A bone-chilling monster stood where Arion had been. The hair-raising undead being called a Death Knight lowered the tower shield that had bashed Arion and stood before them. This was when their despair began. Their panicked squeals echoed through the air. One of the men, huddled together with his comrades, could not bear the oppressive terror and fled with a scream. Under these extreme circumstances, it was only natural that when stretched to the breaking point, people would snap. However, among all of the fleeing man's comrades, not one of them joined him. The reason was that would soon be evident. A black gale whirled past the field of Londas's vision. The Death Knight's body was larger than a normal human's, but its nimble grace was far beyond anyone's expectations. The fleeing man only managed to take 3 steps. Just as he was about to take his 4th step, an arc of silver brilliance cleft his body in 2. The bisected left and right halves of his body collapsed in opposite directions. A sour stench filled the air as his pink internal organs spilled out. Guwoohhh. The blood-covered Death Knight roared as it swung its sword. It was a roar of joy. The look of delight was unmistakable, even on its rotted face. As an overwhelmingly superior slaughter, it savored the despair and terror of the pitiful humans who could not even survive a single one of its blows. Nobody dared attack though they had swords in hand. At first, they had tried an attack though they were afraid. But even those blades which had made it past their foe's defense could not strike a telling blow through the Death Knight's armor. In contrast, the Death Knight did not use its sword, but sent Londa's flying with a shield bash, and it did so without using enough force to kill. It was clearly toying with him, given the way it did not use its full strength. It was plain to see that the Death Knight wanted to enjoy the dying struggles of these humans. The Death Knight only dealt fatal blows in earnest when the knights tried to escape. The first knight to run was Rick. He was a nice guy but a bad drunk. His limbs were chopped off, followed by his head. After seeing the two deaths, the other knights knew the score, so they did not dare to flee. Their attacks were ineffective, and they would be killed if they tried to run. The only thing they could do was wait their turn to be tortured to death. Although there was no way to see their faces below the full helms they wore, everyone present was keenly aware of their fate. The wails of grown men reduced to children echoed throughout the village. These men who had always oppressed the weak had not thought that one day they would be on the receiving end of that treatment. "Oh God, please save me! Oh God!" After hearing these cries for salvation, the strength left Londas's legs and he almost fell to his knees. He loudly cursed the gods, or was it a prayer to them? You lot, go hold that monster back," a desperate knight shouted. He knew that his fate was sealed. His words sounded like an off-key psalm. The man who spoke was standing next to the Death Knight. The way he was stumbling back on his tiptoes to back away from the corpse of his comrade was quite comical. Londas frowned as he looked on that man in his pathetic state. It was hard to tell who had spoken those words because their closed helmets covered their faces and their voices were distorted by fear. Still, he knew that only one man would speak like that. Captain Bellius. Londas's frown deepened. WuxaWorldAudio.com. Overcome by his lewd desires, he had tried to rape a village girl and then sought help from others after he got into a fight with her father. After he was pulled off the other man, he vented his anger by stabbing the father with his sword. That was the kind of man he was. However, his family was quite wealthy in their country, and he had joined this unit because of his family's riches. Everything had gone wrong because he had been made their leader. "I'm not someone who should die here. All of you, hurry up and protect me. Be my shields." Nobody moved. He might have been appointed their leader, but he was not popular at all. Nobody would throw their lives away for a man like this. However, the Death Knight responded to his shouting, and it slowly turned to face Bellius. The only thing praiseworthy about him was that he could make so much noise while standing in front of the Death Knight. Just as Londas began to respect this odd quality of Bellius's, he heard the man shriek in terror. "Money, I'll give you money. 200 gold pieces. No, 500 gold pieces." Those were considerable amounts he was talking about. However, right now, it was like telling them that he would pay them to jump off a 500-meter cliff. Although nobody responded, one person no, half a person moved as though in reply to him. "Ubuar." The right half of the bisected corpse gripped Bellius's ankles firmly. The bloody gargling from its mouth hardly sounded like words. "Ogya!" Bellius screamed in an unnaturally high-pitched voice. The onlooking knights and villagers were frozen in fear, their skin covered in goosebumps. Squire zombies. In Yggdrasil, creatures killed by the Death Knight would become undead of comparable power, haunting the place where they were killed. According to the game's rules, those damned souls who fell to the Death Knight's blade would become its slaves for all eternity. Bellius stopped screaming, and fell like a puppet whose strings had been cut, facing the sky. He must have passed out. The Death Knight drew closer to the defenseless man and stabbed its wavy blade flamberge down. Bellius's body twitched, and Guar. Woken by the incredible pain, Bellius screamed. "Lay me guh. A beg hga. A darenitha." Using both hands, Bellius desperately grabbed the flamberge that had already penetrated his body, but the Death Knight paid his futile struggles no heed and worked the flamberge like a saw. His flesh and armor were cruelly torn open, and fresh blood flew everywhere. Ah he hagib ya money, lay meguh. Bellus's body shuddered, and then he breathed his last. Only then was the Death Knight satisfied, and it stepped away from Bellus's corpse. No, no, please, no. Oh God. Their screams came from seeing the ghastly sight before them. If they ran, they would die swiftly, but if they stayed, they would die horribly. They knew that perfectly well, but still, they could not bring themselves to move. Get a grip. Londas's shout tore through their wailing. The world was filled with silence, as though time was standing still. Fall back. Sound the horn for the horsemen and archers to come here. The rest of you, do your best to buy some time for the hornblower. I'd rather not die like that, if you don't mind. Now move. Everyone moved in an instant. There was no sign of their earlier panic. Everyone moved in silent unison, like a raging waterfall. Their mechanical obedience to their orders without thinking created a miracle. There was no way they could move so immaculately again. The knights each did what they were supposed to do. They had to protect the knight who would blow the horn and signal the others. One of the soldiers who had taken several steps back lowered his sword and withdrew his horn from his bag. OOHH. The Death Knight charged, as though reacting to the horn being taken out. Everyone was shocked. Could it be that the Death Knight wanted to destroy their means of escape so he could kill them to the last man? The flood of darkness drew closer and closer, and everyone knew that stepping forward to try and stop it was certain death. However, the knights still climbed over each other to block the Death Knight one after the other. Their fear was wiped away by an even greater fear, and they surged forward to become obstacles. Every time its shield moved, a knight was smashed through the air. Every time its blade flashed, a knight was cut in two. Dezen, Morit, behead the fallen. Hurry, before they come back as monsters. The named knights hurriedly ran toward their murdered comrades. The shield swung, and a knight was thrown into the air. His body was bisected by the flamberge. 4 men had lost their lives in the blink of an eye. Though Londas was still gripped with fear, he readied his sword against the coming of the jet-black storm, like a martyr preparing to give his life for his faith. Oh, it might have been a meaningless gesture, but Londas did not intend to wait for death. Giving voice to a battle cry, he swung his sword with all his strength at the oncoming Death Knight. Perhaps it was because of his circumstances, but Londas's muscles broke their limit and surprised him. It might have been the best blow Londas had ever struck in his life. The Death Knight swung its flamberge as well. In an instant, the world before Londas spun, and he saw his decapitated corpse collapse to the ground, as his sword swung through thin air. Just then, at that moment, the horn rang out. Manga Ains raised his head as the sound of the horn reached him from the direction of the village. The area around him was covered with the corpses of the knights who had been standing guard here. The stink of blood hung heavy in the air, but Ains paid it no heed as he ran his experiments. Just then, he chided himself for getting his priorities wrong. Ains cast down the sword in his hand. The sword, which had originally belonged to a knight, fell to the ground, its gleaming, razor-sharp edge now stained with dirt. Well, I've said it before, but this physical damage reduction is quite something. Ainsu Algaon Sama. Ains will do, Albedo. Ains's request to be called by a truncated version of his name threw Albedo into confusion. Kufu. Am I really allowed to do that? Would it not be disrespectful to shorten the name of the leader of the 41 Supreme Beings, especially if it is also the name of Nazarik's rulers? Ains did not think that it was a big deal. However, her words meant that she respected the name of Ainsu Algaon, which pleased Ains. Therefore, his reply was phrased in a gentle tone. It's fine, Albedo. Until my former comrades arrive, that is my name. I permit you to shorten it. I understand. No, but please let me address you with the appropriate respect. Then, my master, Ains-sama. Yes, that's right. Albedo twisted her body shyly. However, since she was in full body armor, Ains could not see her beautiful face. To him, she was just acting strangely. Could it be? Could it be that I'm the only one who's allowed to address you in such a way? No. Having someone address me by such a long name all the time would be annoying, so I would like to have everyone do the same thing. Is that so? That's right. Yes, that's what I thought. Albedo's mood turned gloomy all of a sudden. In an uneasy voice, Ains asked, Albedo, what do you think of the name I chose? I think that name suits you very well. It fits my beloved cough. It fits you, in your capacity as the one who united the Supreme Beings. This name was intended to represent the 41 of us, and this includes your maker, Tabula Smaragdina-san. However, ignored the feelings of your master and the others, and took that name for myself on a whim. How do you think they would feel about that? Although I fear to anger you, I pray you will allow me to speak. If my words displease you, then I will gladly take my own life if you command it. I feel that some of the Supreme Beings who abandoned us might object to that name being used by the one who stayed with us until now, Manga-sama. However, they are not here, so if you wish to use that name, all I feel is happiness, Manga-sama. Albedo lowered her head after she finished speaking, and Ains remained silent. The phrase, abandoned us, swirled in his mind like a vortex. His past companions had left him for their own reasons. Yggdrasil was just a game, and they could not abandon their real lives for a game. Manga felt the same way too. Yet could it really be said that he who had been fixated on Ainzu-el-Gaon and the great underground tomb of Nezarec had not been suppressing his anger toward his former comrades? They abandoned me. That might be so, but it might not be. Human emotions are a complicated matter, and there is no right answer. Raise your head, Albedo. I understand your feelings. All right, it's decided. This shall be my name. Until my comrades object, I shall be Ainzu-el-Gaon. Understood. The thought that our most exalted master, and the man I love most would bear this glorious name fills me with joy. The man I love most. The uneasy Ains decided not to worry about this for now. Is that so? I'm glad to hear that. Then, Ains-sama, would you like to spend some time here? Although I would be happy to stand by Ains-sama's side, right, a stroll through the woods would be fine too. He could not do that. Ains had come to save this village. The parents that his sisters had asked him to save were already dead. As he thought of their corpses, he scratched his head. The sight of their bodies reminded him of a dead insect by the roadside. There was no pity, no sadness, no anger. Well, a stroll might be all right. After all, there is nothing of importance to do. The Death Knight seems quite happy to do his job. As expected of an undead being that Ains-sama made. His marvelous execution of his duties is truly praiseworthy. The undead made by Ains's magic and his skills were stronger than ordinary monsters of their kind due to Ains's class skills. Naturally, the same applied to the Death Knight he had just created. However, it was only a level 35 monster, and it was nothing in comparison to the monsters which required XP to create, like Overlord Wiseman and Grim Reaper Thanatos. The fact that it was still fighting until now meant that the enemies were weak. In other words, there was no danger. He wanted to jump for joy when he thought about it, but he had to okay the role of the dignified master, so Ains quashed that thought. However, he clenched his fists tightly, under his robe. The enemies who attacked the village were too weak. Then, let us go check on the survivors. Before Manga set out, he realized that he had some things to do first. To begin with, he deactivated the special effects of the Staff of Ainzu-el-Gaon. The malevolent aura which wreathed it vanished like a candle flame in the wind. Next, he withdrew a full face mask from his inventory. It was gaudily decorated, and its expression was hard to describe, being somewhere between crying and anger. It resembled a Balinese barong mask. The mask looked creepy, but it had no special powers. It was a simple cosmetic item which did not contain a trace of data. Only those who were logged onto Yggdrasil for more than 2 hours, between 7 p.m. and 10 p.m. on Christmas Eve, would possess this mask. No, as long as they were in the game during that period of time, they would automatically receive it. It could be called a cursed item. This mask was known as the Mask of the Jealous, or the Jealous Mask. Once, when he wore this mask, he was flooded by messages. Has the company gone mad? We've been waiting for this. Nobody in our guild has it. Can I PK him? I'm done with being a human being, and other such things in a certain large message board. Then, he took out a pair of gloves. Their rough exterior betrayed the fact that they were crudely made and had no special properties. These gloves were called Jarngraber, and they were an armor item made by one of Ainzualgaon's members for fun. Their only ability was to increase the wearer's strength. He used these items to hide his skeletal appearance. Naturally, there was a reason for this emergency camouflage. It was because Ains realized he had made a fatal mistake. Ains was used to Yggdrasil, and looking like a skeleton did not frighten him. However, to the people of this world, Ains's appearance was synonymous with terror. Both the sisters, who had nearly lost their lives, and the fully armored knights were afraid of him. For the time being, he would use magic items to change his appearance from a dreadful monster to a menacing magic caster. Quote, that ought to reduce how frightening he appeared. Then he thought about the staff. In the end, he decided to keep it with him. Besides, it was not a problem for him. Rather than beg your god for aid, you should not have massacred these people in the first place. With that line, which only an atheist could come up with, Ains looked away from the corpse, whose fingers were folded into a gesture of prayer, and cast a spell. Fly. Ains floated lightly into the sky. Albedo soon followed him shortly afterwards. Death Knight, if there are any serving knights, leave them alive. They are useful to me. The Death Knight sent its acknowledgement of Ains's will back through the mental link they shared. It was difficult to put the distant Death Knight's thoughts into words. Ains flew toward the place from whence the horn blast had come, as quickly as he could. The wind lashed at his body, because he had never flown this fast before in Yggdrasil. The robe plastered to his body felt a little uncomfortable, but that passed swiftly. He soon reached the sky above the village, and Ains looked down on the landscape beneath him. Ains discovered that part of the village square is darkened, as though it had absorbed water. There were many corpses and a few trembling knights, as well as the Death Knight. Ains counted the panning knights, who were too tired even to move. There were 4 of them in total. Though there were more than he expected, a few extra would not be a problem. Death Knight, that will be all for now. His words seemed strangely incongruous with the surroundings, like he were buying something at a store. But to Ains, this situation was as casual as going shopping. He slowly descended to the ground, accompanied by Albedo. The false knights stared at Ains with mouths agape. They had been hoping for a rescue, but what had come was the man responsible for everything, and his arrival shattered their hopes. Greetings, gentlemen. My name is Ainzualgaon. Nobody answered. If you throw down your arms, I can guarantee your lives. Of course, if you would rather fight. One sword was cast to the ground. It was shortly followed by the other swords being thrown down until there were 4 blades on the ground. Nobody spoke during this time. You seem quite tired. Although, don't you think your heads are held a bit too high before the master of the Death Knight? The knights immediately prostrated themselves before him without a single sound. They did not look like vassals before their lord so much as convicts awaiting execution. I will permit you to leave with your lives. In exchange, tell your master your owner this. Ains used the effects of the fly spell to move near one of the knights, and then he removed his helmet with the hand that was not holding the staff of Ainzualgaon. He noted the man's exhausted eyes, and their gazes met through the mask. Do not make trouble around here. If you make a disturbance here, I will slay you with the rest of your country. The trembling knight nodded as hard as he could. His frantic gesture looked quite comical. "Get lost, and make sure to relay this to your master." He jerked his chin, and the knights fled like rabbits. "Ah, this act is tiring." Manga quietly grumbled as he watched the knights run away. If there were no villagers around, he might even have stretched his shoulders. Although he was doing the same thing in the great underground tomb of Nazareth, playing the role of a dignified person was very tiring for an average salaryman like Ains. Yet, until the curtains closed on this act of his, he had to wear yet another mask. Ains resisted the urge to sigh and walked toward the villagers. Albedo followed behind him, her every step accompanied by the clanking of metal. "Clear up your zombie slaves," Ains ordered the Death Knight. As Ains drew closer to them, he could more clearly see the confusion and unease on the villagers' faces. It was not that they were not happy at being rescued from the knights but frightened by the person before them. Ains finally realized this. He was powerful, much more so than those knights, so he did not consider this situation from a weak person's point of view. He decided to reflect on this, and pondered it quietly. If he went too close to them, the outcome would be the opposite of what he was hoping for. Therefore, Ains decided to stop at a distance from them, and spoke in a kindly tone. "You have been saved. Be at ease. You are." One of the villagers was saying that, but even in the middle of speaking to Ains, his eyes never left the Death Knight. "I saw someone attacking this village, so I came here to help." "Oh." As the noises spilled out, looks of relief dawned on the faces of the villagers. Even so, they could not be completely at ease. "What a pain. Should I try a different approach?" Ains decided to handle this in a way he did not like much. That said, this was not for free. "I expect a reward commensurate with the number of villagers whom I saved." The villagers looked at each other. It would seem that they were worried about money. However, their doubtful looks faded away. This crass demand for money in exchange for salvation seemed to have allayed their suspicions somewhat. With the village in its present state, Ains raised his hand to silence the other man before continuing. "We'll discuss that later. I rescued a pair of sisters before I came here. I will go bring them over now. Can you wait here for me?" He had to make sure those sisters did not talk and give away his true identity. Without waiting for them to reply, Ains slowly headed off. At the same time, he thought about using magic to alter memories and a chapter.